The time was 6:47 a.m. The date was March 12, 1944. The place was a muddy, freezing ditch outside Cassino, Italy. Corporal James, Jimmy, Dalton was hunched low, his breath clouding the pre-dawn air. The Leary Valley fog, thick and cold, muffled the distant sound of artillery, making it feel less like battle and more like a fever dream. Then, a new sound cut through the cotton silence, the high-pitched, distinctive whine of a German straight-six engine. An armored scout car, an SDKFZ 222, was rolling toward the company's position at a calculated 15 miles per hour. It was not an assault, it was reconnaissance, the whispering death that called in the thunder later. Dalton had nothing to engage it with. No anti-tank weapons, no grenades, no Teller mines, just his M1 Garand, useless against the armor, and the tool of his heresy, a length of rusted barbed wire wrapped around the handle of a standard-issue entrenching shovel. Every officer in the 34th Infantry Division had explicitly forbidden the use of his contraption. In the next 90 seconds, that improvised piece of wire would not just save an entire company from annihilation. It would force a crack in the rigid edifice of U.S. Army doctrine. The official field manual designated 16 approved methods for disabling light armor. Dalton's wasn't listed. He had been threatened with a court-martial twice for unauthorized field modifications endangering personnel. But regulations are meaningless when you've been standing in the mud for 6 months and have watched 11 men die in 3 weeks because the approved methods require equipment that simply does not exist on the front lines. Dalton could hear the 222's engine grinding through the gears. A sad, mechanical decay. The commander's hatch was open, the German was scanning, confident in his speed and armor. The wire trembled slightly in Dalton's cold, raw hands. One chance. He waited, letting the vehicle draw closer. Jimmy Dalton's war wasn't born in a training camp, it was forged in the blast furnaces of Gary, Indiana. His father worked 15-hour shifts at U.S. Steel, molten iron lighting up the soot-choked sky, a paycheck that barely stretched to feed 6 kids. Jimmy, the middle child, spent his afternoons at the rail yards instead of school. The yards were his academy. He learned which train cars carried what, which couplings failed most often, and how to rig temporary, life-saving fixes with scrap metal, wire, and ingenuity. At 17, he was an apprentice switchman. The work taught him to think in cascading systems. A loose coupler pin could derail 6 cars miles down the line. A frayed cable could snap and kill a brakeman. You learn to see the small fault that leads to the disaster. And you learn to fix it with creativity. Because the company was never going to buy new equipment. He enlisted in January 1943. 8 weeks of basic, a rifle he'd barely fired, and a boat to North Africa. By the time the 34th Infantry Division was grinding its way up the Italian peninsula in September, Dalton knew the recruiter had lied about everything except the travel. The division was slowly ground down like a millstone. German reconnaissance was the silent killer. Light armored cars and half-tracks probed positions at dawn and dusk, calling in accurate, devastating artillery strikes on any troop concentration they found. The SDKFZ 222 was the Wehrmacht's favorite, four-wheeled, open-topped, armed with a 20mm autocannon and an MG-34. It was fast enough to escape, armored enough to deflect rifle fire, and light enough to use mountain tracks where the Tigers and Panthers dared not go. American doctrine offered anti-tank rifles, bazookas, or heavy mines. The 34th had 9 bazookas for the entire division. Anti-tank rifles were obsolete, mines were reserved for fixed defenses, not daily patrols. The result was simple and brutal. Soldiers died while scout cars mapped their positions and called in the artillery that finished them off hours later. Private First Class Eddie Kowalski died on February 18. He fired his M1 Garand, the rounds sparked off the armor. The MG-34 answered. Kowalski, 20 years old, took 3 rounds to the chest. Sergeant Mike Brennan died on February 23, another 222. Brennan missed with a grenade from 30 yards. The autocannon found him instantly. Brennan was the man who taught Dalton how to read terrain and how to keep his feet dry in the Italian mud. Corporal Luis Vargas died on March 4. The scout cars were getting bolder. This one drove right through the company perimeter at dusk. Vargas was caught running for cover. The autocannon was merciless. By early March, 47 men had been lost to reconnaissance vehicles in 6 weeks. Not in battle, but in routine patrols. Every death felt preventable. Every death fueled Dalton's anger at the rigid incompetence of the system. The official response was a masterpiece of military bureaucracy. Maintain defensive posture. Conserve anti-tank assets. Await resupply. Captain Morrison held a meeting after Vargas died. 20 exhausted men in a barn that reeked of wet wool, powder smoke, and despair. Higher command is aware of the reconnaissance problem, Morrison announced, his uniform jarringly cleaner than theirs. New bazooka shipments are expected within the month. Until then, maintain discipline and follow engagement protocols. Dalton spoke from the back, his voice low but cutting through the tension. Sir, the rail yards taught me that when you can't get new equipment, you use what you have. The scout cars are predictable. They have one vulnerability we aren't exploiting, their wheels. What if we rig wire across the roads? Low height, taut enough to catch the axles? Morrison's face tightened with disdain. Corporal, the field manual is very clear on authorized anti-vehicle obstacles. Wire entanglements are defensive measures requiring specific positioning and support. They are not booby traps. The answer is no. We are not setting random tripwires that could injure our own men. Dismissed. Dalton said nothing more, but the denial only reinforced the lesson of the rail yards. The company sure as hell wasn't buying new equipment. And the company sure as hell wasn't going to let them improvise. On the night of March 10, 1944, after two more men, Chen and Harrison, were killed by a 222. Dalton made his decision. The approved methods required equipment they didn't have. The unauthorized method required wire, 2 shovels, and the willingness to risk a court-martial. He waited until midnight. The company was dug in along the Rapido River Valley. He slipped out alone. The night was cold. Mud swallowed his boots with sucking sounds. He grabbed a coil of rusted barbed wire, 30 feet, strong enough, and his 2 entrenching tools. No radio, no witness. He found the road, empty and menacing. He found a spot narrowed between 2 sturdy oak trees. He hammered the first shovel into the ground, 12 inches deep, stable. The second shovel went in 18 feet across. He paced the distance. Then came the wire. He wrapped it around the first shovel handle. 3 loops, tight. His hands were slick with mud, rust, and blood from the barbs. He stretched the wire across the road at precisely 14 inches off the ground. Not ankle height, not waist height, but axle height for the SDKFZ 222. He had measured a destroyed car during a previous patrol. The front axle sat 13 to 15 inches depending on the load. The wire had to catch it perfectly at speed. He wrapped the other end around the second shovel. 3 tight loops again. He tested the tension, pulling hard. The shovels held. He plucked the wire, and it sang, a low, metallic hum, perfectly tuned. Too loose, it would break. Too tight, it would snap. The balance was everything. It was a simple piece of engineering, refined by years in the Gary rail yards. Risk versus reward. He buried the wire under a thin layer of mud, just enough to make it invisible in low light. Not enough to weaken it. The shovels, already dirty and rusted, looked like abandoned tools. The whole setup took 23 minutes. He crawled back to the American lines at 1:15 a.m. He couldn't tell anyone. This was a violation of doctrine, an act of insubordination. He lay in his foxhole, listening to the distant rumble of artillery, waiting for dawn. The wire was out there, taut and invisible. The scout car appeared at 6:43 a.m. on March 12, 1944. Dalton was on watch, eating cold rations. The fog was thick enough to cut, but the engine noise was unmistakable. SDKFZ 222. Moderate speed, coming from the north. 500 yards. The commander was visible, scanning with binoculars. 400 yards. The car stayed on the road. Perfect. 50 yards. It accelerated slightly, perhaps wanting to clear the fog quickly. Dalton could see the front wheels, spinning fast and caked in mud. The wire caught the front right wheel at 6:47 a.m. The effect was instantaneous and shocking. The wheel locked solid, the axle seized, but the car's momentum was too great. 15 miles per hour translated to 22 feet per second. The locked wheel became the pivot point. The entire vehicle flipped violently. First, the nose plunged down, then the rear lifted skyward. The commander had maybe half a second to scream before the car went vertical. It rolled once, twice, 3 times, tumbling down the road in a chaotic shower of mud and torn metal. It stopped upside down. Dalton grabbed his M1 and ran toward the wreck, yelling for cover fire. The scout car's engine was still running, wheels spinning uselessly in the air. The commander was dead, neck broken, thrown clear during the second roll. The gunner was trapped. The driver crawled out through the windscreen. Dazed but alive, Dalton reached him first, pulling the young German clear. Then he looked at the wire. It had held. It was still attached to the front axle. The rusted shovels pulled 20 feet from their initial placement. Dalton quickly unwrapped the wire, coiled it up, and shoved it deep into his pack before any officer could investigate the true cause. Captain Morrison arrived 6 minutes later. He circled the wreck, looking for a blast mark, a bazooka hit, anything that made sense. "Corporal, scout cars don't just flip." "Yes, sir. Must have hit something unseen in the road." Morrison stared at him. He knew something was deeply wrong. But the enemy was neutralized. And no Americans were dead. He let it go. By noon, every soldier in the company knew the official story was nonsense. Private Morrison, the one who took the German prisoner, found Dalton cleaning his rifle at 2 p.m. "Jimmy, I saw wire in your pack. I saw the shovels." Dalton looked up, pausing his work. Morrison was from the south side of Gary, too. They knew each other since childhood. "You didn't see anything," Dalton said quietly. "If I did see something, hypothetically, would it work again?" "Yes. Can you teach me?" That night, Dalton showed Morrison how to set up the wire. 2 more shovels, 30 more feet of barbed wire. Same 14-inch height, same tension, same concealment. By March 25, word had spread not through official channels, but through the underground network that exists in every military unit. The whispered conversations after officers went to sleep. Private Jackson rigged one on the road to San Pietro. Corporal Williams put one across a trail the Germans used for night patrols. None had permission. All were saving lives. The second 222 hit Jackson's wire on March 18. Flipped. Commander killed. The third hit O'Malley's trap on March 21. Disabled. By the end of March, German reconnaissance in the 34th Division sector had dropped by 60%. The 222s were moving slower, taking different routes, showing extreme caution. Something had changed, and they didn't know what. Lieutenant Klaus Richter of the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division was the first German to figure it out. He examined the wreckage of the latest loss. He crawled under the overturned car. No explosive residue, just scrapes that suggested something thin and strong had caught the axle at high speed. He found a fragment of rusted barbed wire embedded in the wheel well. He reported it, insisting on the deliberate placement. German high command was skeptical, but the orders were changed. Scan roads for wire obstacles before proceeding. The cautious approach cut their effectiveness by 40%. Captain Morrison finally cracked the case on April 3, 1944, when he caught Private Williams setting up a wire. 2 shovels, barbed wire at 14 inches. Williams froze. "Where'd you learn this?" "Corporal Dalton, sir." Morrison walked over and tested the tension himself. He was quiet for a long moment. He took out his notebook and began sketching the setup. Measurements. Angles. Wire type. "The field manual doesn't authorize this method." "No, sir. I explicitly ordered Dalton not to pursue improvised anti-vehicle measures." "Yes, sir." Morrison looked down the empty road. The war was still happening. Men were still dying. And here was a method that worked. Required no special equipment. And was saving lives. "Show me 2 more setups before dark. I want to see placement options for different terrain." "That's an order, Private." He wrote a report, 3 pages of technical specifications and statistical validation. He sent it up to battalion. The response on April 19 was predictable. Method unauthorized. Discontinue immediately. Violates field manual regulations. Morrison read it twice. Then he filed it and did nothing. The statistics told a story battalion couldn't ignore forever. In February 1944, the division lost 47 men to scout cars. In March, they lost 12. In April, they lost 3. Casualty rates plummeted. Colonel Anderson, the division intelligence officer, noticed the pattern. His response was pragmatic. He couldn't officially approve a method that violated doctrine. So he issued a memo that went nowhere and turned a blind eye. In May 1944, Dalton was pulled off the line. On May 23, he was called to division headquarters. Colonel Anderson met him. "Corporal Dalton, I've read the reports about your wire method. I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to ask you to train others. The official anti-tank school took 3 weeks. Dalton's method took 1 night and materials from the supply dump. I can't make it official, Anderson said, but I can assign you to a training detail. You teach the method to scout and sniper teams. We call it improvised obstacle placement in the paperwork. Nobody needs to know exactly what that means. Dalton spent 2 weeks teaching 60 soldiers the placement, the tension, the concealment, the removal. It was whispered knowledge, passed from unit to unit. By August, it was in use across the entire Italian front. Conservative estimates credit Dalton's tripwire method with destroying or disabling 43 German reconnaissance vehicles between March and August 1944. Those actions saved hundreds of lives, easily in the 300 to 400 range of soldiers who would have died from subsequent artillery strikes. The official documentation credited the decline to improved defensive awareness. Dalton's name appeared in no reports. The Army preferred it that way. Admitting that a corporal had solved a problem that stumped the engineering corps was bad for morale. James Dalton survived the war. He was discharged in November 1945 as a sergeant. No medals for the tripwires. He went back to Gary, Indiana. U.S. Steel hired him as a switchman in January 1946. Working the same rail yards, the same couplers and cables. In 1949, post-war analysis by Army engineers formally validated the concept. Wire obstacles at axle height were integrated into official doctrine as an approved anti-vehicle method. The training manual credited field observations from the Italian campaign. James Dalton died in 1987. His obituary mentioned he served in World War II and worked 41 years for U.S. Steel. It didn't mention tripwires, scout cars, or lives saved. The method itself lived longer than the man. It is still taught today in variations of IED countermeasures. The principle never changed. Sometimes the simplest solution is the best one. And sometimes soldiers in the mud know more than officers in headquarters. That is how innovation truly happens in war, through the corporals who can't watch their friends die anymore. Through the switchmen who learned to solve problems with wire and shovels. And through the men who risked punishment to save lives and never asked for credit. The wire is still taught. The method is still used. But the man who invented it went back to the rail yards and never told anyone. And sometimes, that's exactly right.